Let's discuss this with global affairs analyst Sam Phatey. He joins me from Washington, D.C. virtually. Good to have you join us.
My pleasure.
Earlier, I'm very sure you remember how President Saied had suspended the constitution and parliament, and he had led by decree. Now there is a new constitution that gives him sweeping powers over the parliament. He cannot be checked by parliament. He also has sweeping powers over the judiciary. Between then and now, I just wanted to comment on all that has happened so far in Tunisia and the new constitution.
Well, it is no surprise that first off, the constitution, the vote accord and a tailored constitution has been passed in Tunisia. Obviously, everybody says it's the start date of democracy and for even from where the birthplace of the Arab Spring. However, we must understand how the dynamics of politics and power plays. And when we talk about referendums and changing constitutions, many do not take the time to read what is entirely in this constitution. So it's the political chess game that is also at play as well. And then you try to convince citizens to come out to vote. Look, I know one of the tactics that opposition politicians use would be to urge people to boycott something because they feel like it's not going to be legitimate. However, I think we tend to forget that whether we boycott or you do not boycott, as long as that vote occurs, it still gives it legitimacy. Currently, one would conclude academically to say Tunisia is more of a democratic dictatorship because if there's no separation of power and then you're giving sweeping powers to an individual over both the judiciary and the legislature, then that's pretty much a dictatorship. The executive arm of government, the judiciary, and the legislature are supposed to independently operate, and they're supposed to be checking one another, especially the parliament. The parliament should actually be the most powerful organ of government in any country, and that is how democracy flows, and that is how it flourishes. But what is happening in Tunisia tells us all the idea of democracy in itself is very fragile and must be protected.
But can Tunisia say that it is still a democracy? One of the reasons for the Arab Spring was because of the autocracy or autocratic rule in that country. But the opposition says that it looks like the country seems to be moving backwards to what it was just before the Arab Spring. So as of today and with this new constitution, can Tunisia say that it is still a democracy?
It is a democracy, and in practice, one can say it is not a democracy. That is left to people and what their opinion is. But when it comes to paper, it is a democracy. It is people that voted for this new constitution. We can argue that it is tailored, it is not tailored, it is what is best for the country at this point in time in terms of giving the presidency a little bit more power. But are these sustainable practices in any nation, especially when you talk about politically fragile countries like Tunisia or mostly in North Africa? When you give the presidency sweeping powers and they say we're going to end corruption, they have the ability to enforce state of emergency, the ability to arrest people in sweeping ways. And in the short term, one can say, yes, that was good. That is how it's supposed to be. But it is sustainable also in the long term. So it's not a sustainable approach. Now, the opposition can cry that, yes, they were intimidated, there was violence, and we have seen this in many elections across the world. Now, the question is, how will the international community take this? Are they just going to condemn it? But are they also going to recognize this constitution and, in effect, by extension, the government of President Saied? And I think while the international community may release one or two statements to say that they have condemned this and it is unacceptable and that Tunisia has relegated from what they hoped it was going to be after the Arab Spring, they are going to respect the decision. And they are going, nobody's going to force them, but they will have no choice but also to recognize and accept the government of President Saied.
And your last point speaks to the issue of legitimacy, and I want to stay there because you have talked about whether the international community will recognize this constitution. But let's also remind our viewers that in 2019, President Saied came into power with a landslide victory. But when you look at this constitutional referendum, just about 27.5% of people turned out, and that's according to a poll in that country. Can he continue to claim legitimacy in terms of his presidency and how he leads going forward?
So there was a low voter turnout. The fact of the matter is a low voter turnout doesn't negate the fact that the elections have occurred and people turn out. You can hold an election and people say we're going to boycott the election. The 5 people that, and let's assume 5 people come out to vote in that election, those 5 people legitimize that election. So there was not 100% people staying home. Those few people that came in and exercised that constitutional right that was given to them legitimized that particular election. And then the total number of votes are going to be counted based on that. So if you look at the reports, even in the media, yes, there was only 25%. But what do they say? 92.2% of that 25% that came out actually voted yes. So it still stands. So if you decide to stay at home and do not vote, well, that's that. But for those that did come out and vote, actually legitimize it. And that is why boycotting elections are only symbolic. They don't actually have an impact as to if a particular government or if a particular legislature or constitution is legitimate or illegitimate. As long as people come out to vote, it stands.
And let's talk about the issues around, what led to the suspension of parliament earlier in Tunisia. Issues around the economic crisis in that country. And President Saied also claimed that the parliament was almost like a stumbling block for him in terms of being able to carry out reforms. He talked about the bickering and just the constant crisis in parliament, and he wasn't able to get things done. He also talked about corruption by members of parliament. And the constitution that was suspended was I think the 2014 constitution, which had a lot of people come together to put that constitution together. Now, it looks like a constitution that has been put together just by one person in terms of being the president. He said he has consulted with relevant stakeholders. But what are the guarantees that this constitution can't remove the bureaucracy that he experienced and then move Tunisia forward in terms of the economy?
Now, this is what I want to say. If President Said's new constitution and the way he wants things done, if it really works out, and then we see a reduction in terms of corruption, and people are seeing economic progress, then there's going to be a conclusion that says, look, in this part of the world or in that country, this is what works. This is the kind of system that works, right? Not every system is going to work in every country the same way. Yes, Parliament do have responsibility. And does it have a valid point when you have a National Assembly or you have a Congress that they're just figuring everything on political device and no work is getting done and they're not doing their jobs? That is why in some countries you have the military take over. And they easily have coup d'etats in certain countries. And the population, while a coup d'etat is very undemocratic and it's a high risk to any democracy, even in an entire subregion, populations turn out to support it because they want results, right? Now, if his plan brings results, it's going to be very difficult to change from that. So he capitalizes on the fact that you have a weak parliament and he wants sweeping authoritarian powers, and he took advantage of it. Now, the question is he doing that for himself and as a way to entrench himself in power, or is he doing that so he would have an easier way to truly do reforms? I mean, democracy is not perfect, so maybe he wants to eliminate those not making excuses for him. He wants to pretty much eliminate those obstacles of democracy in his path to reform. But again, we must also recall that those are short-term. They are not sustainable. So if the 2014 constitution was perfect, it was a great constitution, unarguably.
Right.
One of the best that we have seen emerge out of the Arab Spring. But again, we're talking about a part of the world where sometimes it's very hard to practice sustainable democratic practices.
Well, Tunisia is referred to as the only success story of the Arab Spring. We will see how things play out if we're going to witness mass protests in that country. Thank you so much for talking to us. Global Affairs analyst Sam Phatey.